This week's podcast guest and I go way back. Join me as we welcome Marshall Kirkpatrick, editor of AI Time to Impact. Marshall started his career as a news-breaking technology blogger, which led him to be the first writer hired at TechCrunch. He then went on to co-edit tech blog Read Write Web, where we worked together. After that, Marshall founded a startup called Littlebird, which he sold to Sprinkler in 2016. He recently launched again AI Time to Impact, a newsletter dedicated to capturing the most captivating and crucial developments in AI. And I'll just say, I am really enjoying the newsletter. And just to editorialize for a moment, I would really encourage you to go and actually subscribe to it. As recently as last night, there was an issue that came out that the first time I saw about things that were incredibly relevant to what I was doing, I saw on his newsletter. So again, we'll include a link in the show notes to this, but would really encourage you to subscribe. I also really hope you enjoyed this week's conversation on Agile Giants. All right, Marshall, thanks so much for joining me today. Maybe just to get started, could you talk a little bit about the inspiration behind launching your newsletter?
Sure. Thanks, Sean. I am excited about a lot of things on the internet. I love to learn and I love to use new tools that I discover to do new things. And so the newsletter, AI Time to Impact, was born of that inspiration in multiple ways. I'm working on some news discovery methods. I've been working on news discovery methods, my entire career, as you mentioned, but continuing to evolve those, focused on watching what experts discuss at scale and using data to bring the most important developments in those conversations up to the surface. And AI is such an exciting field right now that it was a really logical place to do that. And I'm finding new tools and new conversations every day rising to the top of the conversation in the world of AI, and then writing up short summaries of them so that the readers of the newsletter can use those tools themselves and have some view into what options are unfolding for us collectively in the future as well. Thinking about how these technologies will impact people, looking at short-term versus long-term impacts, and trying to illuminate some of the options ahead of us, both individually and collectively.
Yeah. So I do want to get to like discovery news and that kind of stuff, but you've sort of, for a long time, been at sort of like the breaking point of what's happening in technology, but both sort of breaking news at TechCrunch and at Read Write Web, but also I think putting that news into context for people. And then obviously you did that systematically at Littlebird. How do you think about the moment in time we're at right now in technology relative to kind of previous transformations you've chronicled in your career?
Oh, I think that there are some big similarities and some big differences. I think that in the early social media, big data eras, there was a real tangible sense of excitement that there were a lot of things newly possible that many people would be able to publish, to analyze, to learn, to instrument new processes in ways that hadn't been accessible before. And, that had both vertical implications, if you will, on things that were newly possible and horizontal implications in terms of who could perform those actions. And the AI revolution, if you will, is similar in that it also feels like there is a risk, similarly, that there may be a lot of disappointment. There may be a lot of unrealized potential. There may be a lot of unanticipated negative consequences. And I really want to do what I can to point towards the positive and the opportunities, and illuminate some of the best voices shining a light on risk in this new transition. I think that the way that it is different, that the first way that comes to mind that it's different is that the technology is, I mean, on some level, it is much more powerful. It is more general purpose. It is even more accessible. Social media enabled anyone to do a whole lot of work and speak to the world. But AI does a lot of the work for you. And that makes entirely new things possible.
Yeah, that is definitely true. Let's talk for a moment, though, first on the similarities. So the shining a light on experts, without disclosing like the full list, like who are some experts maybe that you've come to appreciate who like maybe a lot of people aren't paying as much attention to, and you're like, boy, I would love to shine the light on a couple of these people, because you do a nice job, I think, tapping into the wisdom of experts, not just the wisdom of the crowds, but the sort of wisdoms of experts in these fields.
Thanks. Well, there are three people that come to mind right now. One of the most connected nodes in the network and inspiring people in the arena, as he likes to say, is a man who goes by the name Swyx, SWYX. And he is he's an engineer, but he is sort of the public face of what he calls the AI engineer community, and recently organized an event called AI Engineers Summit. And around his orbit, there are all kinds of exciting new technical things being created and discussed all the time. He's a real smart thinker about the everything that's unfolding. So I'd point towards him. The other person, number two, that I would point to is a man named Simon Willison. And Simon is a guy who was a real innovator in the social media world as well. He's been around for quite some time. And he is also a developer, but really explores the implications and the possibilities of new technologies immediately after they're available. He's a really good public speaker. And then after he speaks publicly, he publishes lengthy explanations full of links and demos on his blog. And he's also a really nice guy. So I get excited whenever I see what he's talking about. And then the third person I would point towards is a woman named Joanna Bryson. And Joanna is a British tech ethicist. She's a technologist first and foremost. But I was just listening to her interview with Azim Azhar on the Exponential View podcast, and her discussion of the technical considerations around risk were, I thought, really well informed and mind expanding. I learned a lot, and have every time I go back and read things that she's written or watch her speak for quite a few years, I've learned a lot and felt inspired.
That's awesome. All right. Well, shining the spotlight on a few other people as well, which is always useful. So let's talk about
those are just three. There are so many, and it's such an accessible world too. There's a place for anybody to jump in. I mean, one of the things that is notable about this, similar to social media, is that there are entirely new voices that are showing up, adding a lot of value, and quickly growing visibility and communities around them.
Yeah, totally agree. So to this point, to the other point you called out, though, this sort of, human and computers doing more of it. Maybe as a way to unpack that, you could talk a little bit about like creative ways you're using AI in your professional life today.
Oh, there are so many. I feel like whenever I do anything and I haven't asked an AI for advice, it's a shortcoming on my part. It's a challenge to just consistently, go to ChatGPT, go to Claude, go to Perplexity, and expand the cognitive power available for any kind of task, especially strategic tasks. I feel like if there's certainly a lot of little things, reformatting things, extracting data, very tactical stuff that is just faster and easier now than ever before. But I find it a lot more interesting and a lot higher leverage to have conversations with these AI platforms about strategic questions. And they're just such a well-informed sparring partner,
right?
If you will. It really, I can think about, preparing for this podcast, I certainly ask for advice from ChatGPT about the best ways to prepare for a podcast. And in my experience, it's one thing to ask an AI a question. It's another to ask the AI what questions you ought to ask yourself. So that's one angle I would take. And then I find that whenever I get a response regarding something important and different possibilities that are available to me in a project that I'm working on, it can be really powerful to, similar to the 5 whys model,
right.
If not literally using 5 whys, just drilling down layer after layer after layer, decomposing a task or an option or a strategic perspective into ever smaller parts, and the AI never gets bored. That's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, Aaron from Box calls it a late night brainstorming buddy, and I think that is like a relevant part of this sort of part of, okay, add perspective, different perspectives, complementary perspectives, things like that. And then I think, to your point, it's less interesting, but it is huge leverage to just also automate those routine cognitive tasks. If you're comfortable, maybe one or two more of these sort of adding perspective things, just, times you've used it where it's been like, hey, this has really helped me, add to my perspective, a creative use.
Sure. Well, one example that perhaps feels less creative, but it feels really important, and I think it could be a good service to others who are listening here, is that when I reflect back on all the ways that I have used these tools, one of the themes that has come up is that several times I've been able to use it as a sort of a professional sounding board for interpersonal communication challenges. I've been able to say to one of these platforms, someone I'm collaborating with is frustrating me. I'm concerned that they're not communicating in good faith even. Or I think that they have some mysterious motivation that is not clear to me, and I can't take it anymore. And then after providing some context and perhaps some examples and some explanation of my role in a project and the other party's role in the project, on several occasions, ChatGPT in particular has told me, look, I think you're wrong. I think that this person that you're communicating with is operating in a very reasonable way, given their role on the project. Here's a way to understand the perspective of that kind of person playing that kind of function in an organization or in a project, and how they might be seeing this as a good faith way to solve common problems. And it has shifted my perspective 180 on some challenging communication, and I am so thankful for it.
I love that example. I've never tried that before, but I'm going to now, and I love that example. That is awesome, Marshall. That is really cool.
I'm so glad. There's something about the emotional distance that it affords that can be useful in many different ways. I've certainly also been in cases where I wanted to provide someone feedback, and as a way to sort of depersonalize it and take some of the sting out of providing some critical feedback, I have said, let's see what the AI has to say. and we've marveled at its wisdom and critical perspective together. And I'll be darned if some of that isn't real good advice that we can agree. I mean, similar to the way people say that the most effective negotiation often occurs when you position yourself not just as advocating for your own personal interest, but collaborating with the person you're negotiating with in order to satisfy the challenging third party who's not in the room. Let's come up with a solution that works well for them. There's something like that AI can be an impersonal oracle.
This is amazing. I always learn something when I'm talking to you. This is amazing. I love this idea. So I could push on that more, but I think that's good. I like this. So using it, that's very creative. I will try that out. So maybe just shifting to a little bit more of kind of business processes now. How do you think about kind of optimizing the business processes for given this new capability as well?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential there because these large language models have billions of parameters. They have just ingested so much written material and have weighted understandings of the relationships between words and phrases and concepts that they just offer so much. So from a process optimization perspective, I really like, well, first of all, just to ask the AI to assist me with optimization of a process. And ChatGPT at least will say, okay, yeah, here are, you haven't told me which one to optimize yet, but here are 10 good steps to start with any kind of optimization process. And you can go through and answer all of those or some of them, and it will do a call and response, being progressively more informed by what you have said in the past. And I really enjoy. So one of my favorite things to ask ChatGPT is to write out a 5-step process for something, or a 3-step process, depending on how much time I want to take to read the response. But I'll say, okay, 5-step process. And then I'll say, all right, step number 2 there, break that down into 5 sub-steps. And it will. And they're generally pretty good. And then I'll say, okay, take step number 2.3 and break that down into 5 sub-steps. And it will just go progressively more and more granular. And sometimes I'll push back and say, I don't know, that one doesn't seem so great. It seems a little duplicative of what was done before, or I don't want to do that. I want to do this instead. And it'll revise those. And much like ideation, what you'll end up with is this incredibly rich, detailed map of possibilities, most of which you either already knew and now have received some validation for, or you don't want to do, and no problem. It was, the cost of generating those ideas was super low, but some number of them, some percentage of them, are going to be high leverage, novel, unforeseen opportunities, steps in a process, or details that you had not accounted for, and the cost of generating that well qualified list of possibilities is $20 a month. Right. For a GPT Plus subscription, and it's available immediately on demand 24/7. So I find that to be really exciting.
I love that. The question for you, just as I was listening to you describe that. So one of my theories is that chat is a wonderful interface to illustrate the power of these technologies, but probably not the interface that we experience a lot of this 2 years from now. And the analogy I often make, Marshall, is like, so my father was a programmer before VisiCalc existed, so before spreadsheets were a thing. And a big part of his job used to be like updating financial models programmatically. This, not now, but in the 70s, was updating financial models programmatically. So like CFO's team comes to him and says like, hey, if we sold 5% more of this and 3% less of that, could you rerun what our finances would look like? And then VisiCalc came along, right? And all of a sudden, everybody in the finance department was like, holy cow, computers are really good at numeric computation, right? Which obviously he knew already. He had, been doing this as a programmer. But I think ChatGPT and chat as an interface in general is really helpful at showing us generative AI as a UI. As I was listening to you talking about this processes, like I can't help but think, I don't think the right UI to do what you just described 2 years from now is a chat interface. Like I feel like that's an important enough function. I have suspicion that when we think about business processes 2 years from now and things like that and process optimization, this is more likely to happen in UIs that are not call and response text-based chat. I don't know if you've thought about like what you wish the tool would look like, and we're beginning to see some things in computer vision today around this. But have you thought about if you gave Marshall a magic wand, what the UI he would interact for business process optimization like that would look like?
I have not. I mean, I love mind mapping. I would love to have and have not found an automated way to populate a mind map in great detail. Mermaid graphics is a format that ChatGPT will do some output in, but it's not great. I've seen some people and I have had a lot of fun taking mind maps that I've made, exported them in OPML format, put them into ChatGPT. It said, this is a mind map on the following process. Please expand on it. And then had a bunch of proposed new nodes that's fun. I'd love to have something like that in an automated way. We were talking about a story that came up just yesterday in the AI Time to Impact newsletter about LangChains exploring some asynchronous interfaces, where they said, what would be possible if you didn't expect an immediate response like a chatbot, but instead gave the system 5 or 10 minutes or even longer to do extensive analysis and discovery and summary and synthesis and write a long form report. And LangChain just made a template for that available yesterday. So I agree that there is a lot of new possibilities. Oftentimes I don't appreciate what's possible until I can get it in my hands and really start using it. Voice didn't seem terribly interesting to me until I started listening to speeches in Spanish on YouTube with Whisper from OpenAI open on my phone, and asking those speeches to be translated into English, then pausing them and asking for historical context around what the speaker was referencing. And that felt amazing. And, now I remember when I first saw Twitter, I thought it was stupid. And now I've spent the last 17 years of my life building a career largely around it. So I that was a good, humbling experience. I don't know what future UIs will look like for AI.
Yeah, I think the LangChain example is a good one, right? The report template that they just came out with. I would say by the time this is published, that'll be 3 or 4 weeks old, probably. But as of when we're
Ancient
recording,
history.
Right? But as of when we're recording that came out last night, and that actually, the article I referenced in the intro, that was the article we were talking about. So
wonderful. Will you tell me, Sean? Can I ask you on your own podcast?
You can ask me anything you
want. Oh, well.
Fire away, Marshall. Here we go.
In that case. What do you have a vision for UIs that would be powerful for these AI tools?
So I think there's going to be a bunch of them, right? I think just like you could make the argument Excel led to the entire sets of categories of enterprise software. So ERP, all the FP&A software, CRM, right? Like it was putting that in business users' hands and helping them. And so we ended up with a bunch of UIs around that. I think you're going to see the same thing around generative AI. And I do think LangChain's doing a nice job to push the envelope, but still it's fairly correctly given their business strategy. It's fairly Python driven today. Whereas I think we need to think about sort of tools that prosumers and business users could use on this as well. It's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about the sort of no-code tools on top of LangChain. There's unfortunately a lag from the tool to being kept up to date with the LangChain library, but I'm excited about those tools because they do a nice job of like letting people use them. As it relates to the business process thing that you were mapping out, part of what was coming to mind is like memory and state of memory is going to be different than memory in a chat environment there, right? So if I were using something like that, I'd want it to remember like, okay, this is my business process for these things. And then I can come back at any point and expand it, as well as what I would really love in that case is to have that visually mapped out and have some type of agent that's constantly looking for ways to automate and improve that and giving me suggestions on a regular basis, right? So this is not the same thing, but to give an example of this, we had a corporate client we worked with who has a voice of customer database of basically things that their customers wished were possible in the market that they play in. And most big companies have this, right? So it's like, we know that in our market, there's customer pain on these, 50 areas. And what we did is we helped them build an agent that scanned academic journals for new capabilities in the field that they were in, and then compared those capabilities against those needs, right? And so this is what I mean by like different UI. Like that's not really a chat UI. Now, I suspect that company would have never been interested in doing that had they not first experienced generative AI in a chat-based UI. Just like Larry Ellison probably has a hard time creating the categories of software he creates if Dan Bricklin doesn't introduce VisiCalc, right? So this is an important point, but I think the UI is going to continue to evolve. And I had not thought about the business process mapping one until you were talking about, which is why I just sort of wanted to riff with you on that for a moment.
Yeah. When I think about processes, in particular, an optimization of processes and the opportunities that get surfaced there, one of the models that comes to my mind is from a different context, and that's from one of my favorite books, Josh Waitzkin's book, The Art of Learning.
Yeah.
So Waitzkin was a childhood chess prodigy who got burnt out on being a world champion chess player and went into martial arts and then became a world champion martial artist, and then wrote a book about what those two experiences had in common around building expertise in either context. And I read the book almost once a year at this point. It's fun and inspiring, but there is one part of the learning process in particular that he talks about there that feels really relevant to me, in particular when it comes to the drilling down, decomposition, and the segmentation capabilities of these LLMs. And that is what he calls the soft zone of being in a martial arts competition and being more aware of the moments of transition in between moves than his opponents are aware, so that he can then insert actions on his part into those moments of transition to gain a competitive advantage. And it feels like these AIs are just a natural partner to do that in a collaborative as opposed to a competitive way, to just help zoom in deeper and deeper and deeper until we find levels of granularity that are greenfields of possibilities, especially in a social context where I don't know, maybe that's taking it too far.
No.
Maybe other people are thinking about those things as well, but that at least helps serve as oversights, things that you may not have foreseen, and perhaps opportunities to gain competitive advantage and come up with new ideas as well.
Yeah, I don't think that's taking it too far. And in fact, I think you wouldn't know this because it hasn't published yet, but the episode right before you is Carl Ehrlich, who's the Wharton professor who did the ChatGPT versus Penn student test on brainstorming, right? So he has 200 ideas from University of Pennsylvania students, and then he has 200 ideas from ChatGPT, and he compares the quality of the results from the two different universes. It's kind of a classic academic study on efficacy. But in the episode, he sort of points out, although he teaches at Wharton, he's never taken economics and he's not an economics guy, but he sort of says, like, if I were to put on my economics hat for a moment, right, and sort of pull on the sort of AJ prediction machine framework a little bit, right, when you make things like this so much less expensive than they ever were before, it just changes how you think about the things that are next to that, right? So, they came up with 200 ideas for effectively $1 an idea. Now, if you think about, like, what does it cost a company to come up with an idea, right? It's probably literally 1,000 times more expensive. It's probably $1,000 for a company to come up with an idea. If you think about, design thinking workshops that might come up with 10 or 15 ideas, what's the cost in human capital and service providers and resources to do that, right? So if you make that 1,000 times cheaper, it changes the value of the things that intersect with this. And so to your point on this soft zone, when there's things that you used to think of as really hard and really expensive that are now inexpensive, thinking about where those intersect with it, we are going to have to resort our economic models around this, because now things that historically we thought of as, not that valuable because it was prohibitively expensive to do the things next to it may not be anymore. And I think this sort of learning concept of soft zones is a helpful way to think about it for sort of broadly knowledge work. So I like you calling that out as well. I thought that was really smart, Marshall.
Neat. Yeah. What an interesting variation on the innovator's dilemma, perhaps.
That's right. This is sort of the anti-Christian sin. That's exactly right. And I think it's sort of the argument that AJ and his co-writers make in the book Prediction Machines as well, right? So we commoditize this so value flows in different ways as well.
I feel like when we were growing up, Sean, presuming that process is done, it's not done. Right. But
I'm definitely not done growing up, for sure. Right? Just to be clear. Yeah, that's not.
Yeah. Right on. Yeah, me either. I feel like I used to hear people say often, in the future, it won't be about what you know, it'll be about your ability to ask the right questions. And I felt like that's been true for a long time, but it feels more true now than ever before.
100%.
And in that kind of experiment that you're describing, I imagine that really there's a lot of leverage available in creating the right AI system, that whether that's the right prompts in ChatGPT or using an entirely different model with different documents, to set up the AI to most effectively generate the largest number of high quality ideas, to make sure that perhaps it can catch some outliers and not just revert to the mean of the most predictable new ideas. And the ideas themselves are one thing, but building the idea machine and operating the idea machine and knowing what questions to ask feel like exciting perhaps newly valuable questions.
100%.
Skills.
It's the co-pilot model, right? Like you got to give Microsoft credit. They 100% nailed the analogy there. I'm going to get on a plane tomorrow. It's equally scary to me that if they came on and said there's nobody in the cockpit or the navigation system's not working. I want to get off the plane equally quick with either of those announcements, right? So the analogy, they've really have nailed the analogy there. But the other part of this,
So Sean,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Marshall.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but so what are the emergent qualities that become possible then when we've got both a good pilot and a good co-pilot collaborating?
Yeah, so I'm spending a lot of time thinking about that as it relates to innovation specifically. So I think it's different for different categories of work, but I have this hypothesis that innovation will actually be the blueprint we use for a lot of knowledge work in the same way that, when I dropped out of school at Carnegie Mellon 20 years ago to do machine learning in the kind of classic sense of machine learning, we went to Wall Street because predicting stock prices was a pretty good place to figure out, how to realize economic value for predictions, right? So the old verbs of machine learning were predict, classify, cluster. Now you've got this fourth verb of create. I suspect the create verb is going to be, we'll figure out the economic model there, primarily starting in innovation. In innovation, I think what you're going to see is new models of how people innovate. So to make this real for people that kind of think a lot about startup innovation, we might need to think about a different model than startup accelerators, which, by the way, there's precedent for. The startup accelerator model came along right after cloud computing and mobile computing changed the cost model of creating startups by roughly an order of magnitude, right? Like I remember selling all the servers I bought for my second startup to go to a $500 a month credit card bill. It completely changed the calculus of doing, and what Y Combinator and Techstars deserve a lot of credit for coming along with saying, hey, the economic model has changed by an order of magnitude. Instead of spending a bunch of time writing a business plan, let's spend time creating prototypes, and then we will get a bunch of people to look at those prototypes in sort of a gamed dynamic where we'll get good terms for you. And so don't spend time on Sand Hill Road saying synergy in conference rooms. Build software, do demos, and we'll set up a situation to make that work and viable for you. And obviously today, plenty of non-software companies are going through accelerators, but the point is we changed the process of building startups predominantly because of this enabling technology of cloud and mobile. I think the same thing's going to happen with generative AI. And so you could imagine a very different funding and startup creation model. So for example, maybe instead of starting with the prototype, maybe you start with a problem space and you build 50 prototypes in 2 weeks. And then you look at which of those 50 prototypes actually work out. And then you build 5 higher fidelity prototypes of the most promising ones. And so now maybe I'm not interviewing for your ability to create prototypes. I'm interviewing for your ability to empathize with problems and pick big, compelling problems and get, so you could end up with a very different model here.
Wow.
As an example, like that's an example on the innovation front. Again, I think there are other categories as well, but we need to remember that like we should be looking for these categories against that verb create, just like 20 years ago, we looked at these categories against the verbs predict, classify, cluster, which was basically all of machine learning in the enterprise till about 2.5 years ago, or 95% of machine learning in the enterprise till 2.5 years ago.
Wow. That is fascinating and really exciting. It makes me want to, and maybe I'm rushing things, and I'll read your book, presumably, or watch all of the episodes of your show. But What's another? Okay, so that dynamic there is thanks to generative AI, prototypes, the cost of prototyping drops dramatically unless we do a whole bunch of them. Yep. Okay, so that's one. You said one way that things could shift against the verb create, but one of many. Will you be so generous as to share with us another one?
Sure, I'll do one more for sure. So a different type of create that I think is interesting as well is in this sort of, how do you think about scaling up the things that you're creating, right? So I tend to think about it as ideation, early idea validation, and then scaling the idea, sort of the general commercialization innovation process. And we've talked a bit about brainstorming already with the prototyping. I gave you a little bit of a flavor on this idea of validation. So let's think about scaling up. Okay, so one of the things that many of the best technologists struggle with is how to think about the right revenue model, how to kind of create the right revenue model against the value that they've created. And I think an underappreciated part of entrepreneurship is what I would describe as revenue model product fit. So we talk a lot about product market fit, but and I think you and I were actually both in the room when this happened years ago with the Google founders, but I will never forget in my life, John Battelle going at Larry and Sergey at the Web2 Summit, like, how are you going to make money? How are you going to make money? And, John is I would argue, one of the best interviewers in the tech business at that point. So he was doing it in a way that only probably he and maybe Tim O'Reilly could get away with, but fairly aggressively, right? And I remember at one point, Larry, just exhausted, says, look, worst case scenario, we'll run punch the monkey ads on google.com. Because if you remember, like at that point, Yahoo had those banner ads with the monkey across the top, click on the monkey and it would send you to the page, right? Now, turned out Google correctly, and for a variety of people deserve a lot of credit for this, was careful, and they waited, and they came up with a revenue model that really fit with the business and the product value that they were delivering. And today that's created a machine that prints money in Mountain View, right? So good that they didn't go with the punch the monkey ads, I think is one takeaway from this. But if we think about create as a verb for a minute, part of what you need to do once you get from ideation and idea validation is you need to create the right revenue model to match against the value that you're delivering. And working with different entrepreneurs on this, I've seen some really creative prompts and really chains of prompts to help entrepreneurs think about this. And this makes me really excited because it takes that skill, that create skill specifically of, okay, here's a problem, let me think about the right revenue model. And it kind of democratizes it in a way where I think creators who are creating magical things, that they're just not getting the appropriate value out of it, it is also things that you could imagine sort of being arbitraged away or sort of commoditized, so that again, the cost of that goes down. We'll use the AJ framework, and the cost of that goes down, and so the value of these other things that we thought of as unreasonable before. So that's kind of a different create
cool
term there as well.
Love it.
So I realize that we're pushing time here. I want to ask you kind of two more questions to kind of wrap this up. So the first is, I think one thing that you are particularly good at is when you see these tools, you change your workflow quickly to adopt them. I remember all the way back to when we were working together at Read Write Web, you did an amazing job of like building tools to help you break news and then using them. And we would give them to other people on the team, and they would never get as much value out of them as you did because they didn't change their behavior the way you did. And probably a bunch of scar tissue around that. But the point is, you did a really nice job changing your behavior to reflect the tools that you were using. And in this point in time, I think people being kind of AI default is really important. They got to change their behavior to be kind of AI first and AI default. Any encouragement you might have for people trying to make that transition to change their behavior?
That's interesting to think that that's what the problem was back then, and it's interesting to hear from a friend what the solution was as well. Like why was it that I was able to use those tools in a particularly effective way? No one had told me before. It was because I was willing and able to change my workflow accordingly. So thank you for that perspective. That's really generous. And now I'm going to go and reevaluate my whole life. I hate.
That was not the goal. That was not the goal.
Oh, please, is it not? I mean, that's like the discursive equivalent of what you're saying I'm capable of doing with technology. Let's do that, here and as a result of this dialogue. I mean, that's great. Seriously though, to zoom out a little bit from that, I mean, finding out what works and finding, positive feedback loops can pretty quickly become the path of least resistance, if that's not too cliche to say. I feel like I found things that worked well for me, that people praised me for, that helped me, make money and get attention and break news stories, as a journalist and what have you. And I dug deeper and just kept going down those same directions. And there might have been other paths. There might have been more breadth that I could have pursued and not been such a T-shaped or a pie-shaped person going deep on a handful of tools and approaches in particular. And now that we're entering into this new era with AI being so accessible, on some level, I'm doing the same thing. I'm saying, when something works real well, like for example, on a lark, I decided once to ask ChatGPT to explain a complex concept to me using a baseball analogy, because I love baseball, and it did a great job of it. And I said, "Oh, I'm gonna do that again." And now I've done that probably 100 times, but I've tried other things that really didn't work as well. And so, so having a spirit of experimentation, going where the early results are, and investing in winners of strategies, I think are good. I mean, generally speaking, when I think about habit formation, I really like BJ Fogg's approach of make it small, tie it to an anchor habit, and celebrate each time you do it. And so sometimes I will say, after I do a debrief on a project, that's kind of an established anchor habit that I'm pretty good at doing. Then I'm going to do something. I'm going to pick up my ChatGPT mobile app, and I'm going to maybe narrate or OCR in my notes and ask for it to extend on my analysis, or to reflect on it, or give me feedback, or what have you. And then I feel happy and celebrate in my mind when I do it. But I mean, there's just so many different ways to try to build a new habit of using a new technology, and doing so thoughtfully just offers so much potential. I'll toss out two more real quick role models. I really like, there's a Forrester analyst named Rick Parrish that says that when he has a model of discipline where he says a practice that you're doing with discipline has 4 qualities to it: rigor, or following a documented best practice; cadence, and coming back to it consistently. Coordination, where you're coordinating that practice with other stakeholders and other practices that, in the larger context. And then the fourth quality is accountability. In a corporate context, making sure that someone senior who is accountable for the project, but in a personal context, that might be keeping a log and setting goals and, something like that. And so when I think about trying to innovate with discipline using AI, I think of what should be the process I follow, what cadence should I do this practice with, how can I coordinate this with other parts of my life and work, and how can I be accountable to myself to actually give it a good faith period of experimentation. Those are some things that I do. And the last thing I'll share is that I do feel like there's just like we're not going to automate everything, but the hybrid models are really exciting. I think there's a lot of offline thinking processes that can be really helpful. I find AI often powerful, not even as a literal tool, but as an analogy and as a way to think about thought, to learn about artificial intelligence as a way to reflect on the structure of my own non-artificial intelligence. And one of the things that I do, sometimes using those analogies and sometimes otherwise, is I'll sit down with pen and paper and just set aside literally 5, maybe 10 minutes. Honestly, 5 minutes for me is more than enough. And just write free form, going deep thoughts on something I'm working on. And I consistently then go back and see 1, 2, 3 of the sentences I just wrote are like real keepers and things that I wouldn't have thought of had I not spent even that 5 minutes of deliberate, focused attention on. So when thinking about how to effectively apply a new tool or technology to my work, take 5 minutes and just focus on imagine what could be done on a particular problem or challenge that you're working on, or with a new tool that you're learning about. And that may be really effective for people as well.
Yeah, I love that. I think implicit in what you're saying too is that like this stuff is often learned by doing. It's an experiential learning discipline. And so taking this approach and having these experiences is valuable. Realizing we're kind of actually at time, just one last question for you is, beyond this experiential learning, anything else that you would encourage people to think about doing as they try to think about the future world that we're heading into with AI and planning for the future that's coming?
Well, I'm in the news business, and so it is talking my own book a little bit, but I think that there is really a powerful there's powerful leverage that comes from staying up on the newest developments in a field, not just as inside baseball, not just as drama, but especially in technology. This is a stream of new tools being made available to pick up and use in your work to make existing work more efficient or new work possible. And so I think that the folks who consistently follow new developments in the field are going to have both a practical access to new tools and just feel inspired with the sense of possibility that comes from witnessing everybody's innovation all going on all the time, that will help fuel your innovation and breakthroughs in your own work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So again, I said at the beginning, but I'll say, because it's less promotional coming from me than you, I really do encourage everybody to go subscribe to Marshall's newsletter. Like it is really good, and he's a friend, and I like Marshall, so I am biased, but I'm telling you, I've shared it with lots of people who don't know who Marshall is, and like it is quickly becoming a must read for so many. So would encourage you to do that. Marshall, outside of the newsletter which we'll promote, what are the best ways for people to kind of keep aware of all the different projects and things you're working on? Your Twitter, or what's the best way to kind of keep up to date with you?
Well, as my wife, who sends her warm regards to you, said today, they don't even call it that anymore. The old X.com. There is certainly that. I'm finding more and more opportunity and connection and fulfillment on LinkedIn lately than ever before. My personal website is marshallk.com. And if you are excited about stuff like this, shoot me an email. And I'd love to chat and hear your perspective on these matters. This has been so fun, Sean, to get to hear and catch up with you on how you're thinking about all of these. Again, our thinking is similar and different in some really, really exciting ways. So thanks.
Thank you, Marshall. Thanks for the time, and please do give my best to Michelina as well. So this is great, fun episode, and I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I do. Thanks so much, Marshall.